If tenant deposits are showing in your profit and loss in Xero, it's wrong. A deposit isn't income, it's money you owe back to the tenant. There are two sides to record. Firstly, the deposit you received and the deposit you've protected with the scheme. Get both right and your Xero is accurate with a clean profit and loss and balance sheet. In this video, I'll show you how to correctly record tenant deposits in Xero, whether you self-manage or use a letting agent. Watch in for the demonstration. Starting off in the Xero homepage then, so you can see I'm on a demo company. So we're going to click on to reconcile transactions. So first off, I'll show you that if you're self-managing your properties, this is the way to do it. You're going to have received a deposit amount from your tenant, and then you will have paid that same amount to one of the recognized deposit providers, such as in your reconciliation tab, there's going to be two different transactions, one showing the deposit received and one showing the deposit protected. So one's a receipt and one's a payment out. The first thing we're going to do, if we haven't already got this set up, we're going to have to make sure there's the correct chart of accounts to enable these transactions to go in the right place. So I've got a property investment specific chart of accounts, which you can download and put into your Xero. Details are in the description, so make sure you click and download yours. But what I'll show you just now is how you can manually set up the two chart of accounts. Basically, there's two different accounting codes you're going to need. One to show the deposit received from a tenant and one to show the deposit that's protected. And essentially how they're going to be treated is the deposit received is a liability. It's basically something that your business owes back to the tenant, obviously assuming they meet all of their obligations. The second part then is an asset. So it's money technically owed back to your business by My Deposits or whichever provider you use. And so the important thing is neither of these two transactions are treated as in the profit and loss. So either income or expenses that your company have, they're treated on the balance sheet, which shows what the company owns, its asset, and what it owes, its liabilities. So let's go on to now the chart of accounts, and I'll show you how to set up the two codes. So click on accounting and then chart of accounts. Firstly, we'll do the liabilities. So click onto liabilities, and we're just looking for a code that's free. So let's see, 806 is free. So we'll click add account, number 806, and we're going to call it tenant deposit received or something similar. It's just really important you can tell the difference between that. And then we're going to add one for the asset. So click on assets. Again, look for a code which is free. So let's go with 621. Let's call this one tenant deposits protected. And that's where you should make sure the title is slightly different to the one that you're going to use for the deposits you receive. Current asset, and we're going to click save. So what we'll do is then we'll just process these two transactions. So we'll create a contact. So J Smith is the tenant. So remember, we've got two. That's why you need to make sure that they're slightly different so you can tell which one's which. So we're going to click on tenant deposit received. Then we're going to process that transaction. With this one, I'm going to use My Deposits as the who, create a new contact, and then tenant deposit protected, and click OK. What we'll do now is we'll click over to the balance sheet. I'll just show you how they've both been processed. So click under reporting, balance sheet. Make sure it's today's date. Click update. Yeah, I can show you they're both here. So we've got current assets, tenant deposit protected, £1,200. Tenant deposit received, 1,200 in creditors amount due after more than 1 year. So you can see that both transactions have been recorded correctly. In the balance sheet, there's nothing showing in the profit and loss. So what I'm going to do now is show you what happens if you actually have a managing agent which looks after these transactions for you. Let's go over to that now. So click on to back into home, click on to reconcile. You'll see there's the separate transaction here. It's just a repeat of the same transaction details, but I'll show you in a second how it's broken down. If you use a managing agent, the important thing is you're going to receive one rental payment, but it's not the total amount of rent you receive. So it's basically the net rent you receive after the agent deducts any things like management fees, any maintenance they pay for, but also things like deposits, transactions, which they'll process on your behalf. So what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to manually adjust them, because if we just go off what's paid to you, the net rent, it's going to mean that the accounts are going to be missing important information like the total amount of rent you receive, and also any agent fees you pay for, and also any deposits that are protected. So that's why it's really important to go into any rental statements and to interrogate them in more detail. So I've just created a dummy letting agent statement. This is kind of typical as to what you might receive from your letting agent. And it's basically showing here the total amount we receive, which is £1,500 in this case. The management fee we've paid, which is typically about 10%, which has been deducted by the agent. and then the VAT charge on that. And then it shows you what the net amount which was paid for you, which marries with the amount which was in Xero. So it's 1,320. There's also a couple of other transactions here which you're not even going to have any sight of unless you go into the agent statement, which shows the deposit received by the tenant and also the deposit then paid by the agent to the My Deposits in this case. So what we're going to need to do is go into Xero and do a manual journal for these transactions. So again, bearing in mind we've already set up the two tenant deposit accounting codes. What we can start off by doing is just processing these transactions. We're going to click on the who being the letting agent. We're going to put rents receivable, and then we're going to click OK. What we need to do now though is a manual journal. So we're going to click under accounting, under manual journals. If you haven't got access for this in your view, you might need to speak to your accountant or whoever controls your Xero account and make sure they give you full rights to access all the features of Xero. So I'm going to click manual journal. We're then going to click new journal. Then I'm just going to create a narration. So just give it a description that's easy to remember. When you look back at it in future, you'll know what it is. Put the correct date in. And there's a few different lines we're going to have to process. There's the amount, the deposit received from the tenant, which is a liability, it's owed back to them. And then there's the deposit protected in My Deposits, which is an asset, which is owed back to your business. So let's set those two accounts. So you've got tenant deposit received and then tenant deposit protected. So with manual journals, you have to understand a little bit about basic bookkeeping. And essentially the key kind of takeaway is that all debits must equal credits. You have debits and credits, and the totals of both must equal each other. Otherwise you can't process the manual journal. It's £1,200, which was received, which is a liability, which means it's a credit. So debits increase expenses and assets. Credits increase liabilities and income. So 1,200 in here, and then to account for what's being protected using My Deposits, which is an asset. So remember that debit increases assets, that's £1,200. So if we were just looking at the tenant deposits, then that would be able to process that, but there's also a couple of other parts to the transaction, to the rental statement we need to account for as well, which I'll just show you how to do now, even though it's not the main purpose of this video. So going back to the rental statement then, I've already marked off the deposits, that's already been dealt with. There's also management fees and the VAT on that. So just go off the total amount, which is £180. And basically we need to account for the difference between the net rent, which was received into Xero and has been recorded already as net rent, and the gross rent, so the total amount of rent that you received. So I'll show you how to do that now. So there's two more transactions. There is letting fees in this case, or whatever you want to call it, and that is an expense. Then with debits increase assets, so that's £180 in there. But then remember, because your rent was reduced by this much because of the agent fees, we need the corresponding credit needs to be income, which is rent receivable, and that'll be £180. And you can see now that debits equal credits, and therefore we can post a transaction. The final point is how to treat the deposit when a tenancy ends. So assuming it's repaid in full, you simply reverse the journal, reducing the liability and the asset by the amount of the deposit, or you record the opposite of the initial transactions if you self-manage. The transaction paid to the tenant should reduce the liability on the balance sheet, and the transaction received from My Deposit reduces the asset by this amount. If any of the deposit is withheld from the tenant to pay for damages, then and only then is this amount treated as income. To summarise then, you need to ensure deposits from tenants are correctly recorded in Xero, and there's two sides to it. Firstly, the deposit you receive, which is a liability in the balance sheet owed to the tenant, and the second is a deposit which is protected, which is an asset owed to your business from the deposit protection provider. Ensure you don't treat the deposit as income unless any deposit is withheld due to payment of damages. Hope you find this video useful. If so, you're going to love this next one, which is a full Xero setup for a property investor. If you haven't got time to set up yourself, then I offer a Xero setup service, which you can book below.